In a socially distanced world, Design United is an optimistic digital platform for collaborative design and connection. Design United was created in March 2020 during a period of intense lockdown and quarantine measures within the region. The aim behind Design United was to create an optimistic space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for young regional designers and design practices. A much needed network of support and peer mentorship during these uncertain times. Talented young designers and design studios working on design innovation with an approach that is relevant to our South Asian region have been invited to be a part of the platform. We also encourage design students from the region to share their work, be involved in the dialogue, and to be an active part of Design United. Design United, most of all, believes in creating a community of designers and design knowledge that is largely contextual, with focus on contributing to the environment and our community. Design United believes greatly in a spirit of collaboration and idea exchange.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in Design United's second design conversation. We will be in conversation today with the wonderful ThreeFlaneurs, Ekta, Idnany, and Sahil Latheef. ThreeFlaneurs is an initiative started by Ekta and Sahil to understand and appreciate architecture, both in India and abroad. With the belief to understand architecture, it is important to visit, participate, and engage directly with the built environment and its designers. Through this initiative, they've organized several well-attended and appreciated public design events showcasing outstanding contemporary architecture, landscape, and urban design. They also conduct focused group study tours to explore built environments in varied cultures and geographies. Ekta joins us today from Mumbai. Ekta is an architect and a culture enthusiast. She teaches architecture in Mumbai while running her own design practice. She's also a writer and has written for several design magazines. Ekta strongly believes that traveling gives her a better understanding of differences and similarities of human nature across different cultures that make her a better designer and writer. Sahil, who co-founded ThreeFlaneurs with Ekta, is an architect and an aspiring naturalist. He joins us today from Dubai. Sahil has a keen interest in urban arts projects, conservation, and urban research. He has worked in London, Singapore, Mumbai, and Dubai. He has been a part of several research initiatives that have been exhibited at multiple international architecture biennales. For the past 10 years, Sahil has also been passionately involved with architectural pedagogy at various design institutes in Mumbai and Dubai. It's a real pleasure to have them on Design Conversation today. A very warm welcome to you, Ekta and Sahil.
Thank you so much, Varna. So, hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. And here ThreeFlaneurs is an initiative that was started as a travel blog in 2017 by Sahil and myself and another friend and colleague, Amrita. Basically, we started it as a way to document our personal travels to experience architecture. And after having traveled for over a decade, we wanted to continue to explore more architecture and travel. Like, we were not done with it by any means. And it seemed like a good idea then to take along more people on these journeys with us. Apart from the blog, we run a travel program where we curate itineraries to different destinations, and we kind of try and cover possible within those destinations and try to understand the larger context. And the third sort of concern that we have is one where we're very curious about what's happening in contemporary Indian architecture, and we designed another program around that, where we could visit projects of contemporary architectural interest across cities in India. And so after the first few years now, we've kind of visited enough projects, and we've experienced a significant number that we are now able to draw out patterns between projects across cities. And this kind of starting to give us an empirical insight into the underlying concerns that architects in India are dealing with. And our hope is to be able to generate a better understanding of these and shed some light, given the speed at which our environment is urbanizing. Apart from this, Sahil and I are engaged in teaching, and we've been doing that for the last 10 years. So all of these kind of concerns somewhere align with education. Um, so moving on, like we've now we started the India Architecture Open series in February of 2018, and we started with the Mumbai Architecture Open with the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. Um, so the idea behind this event is that during a particular weekend, we would open up 6 to 8 projects across the city, invite people to sign up and participate, visit these projects along with the designers of the project, and engage in kind of experiencing the project, discussing with the designers, sharing concerns, sharing knowledge about materiality, construction techniques, etc. So our project selection, I mean, we had to be very focused as to how we would kind of select these projects. And our project selection criteria, as you can see on this slide, is that these would be contemporary projects dealing with the situation as it is now. And we would kind of look to open up projects that are difficult for people to access on their own. So, I mean, the support of the architects is very important in these, because we're visiting private homes and other institutions. Also, we're looking at examples of architecture that can across scales and across programs, and and also across kind of like architectural concerns. So from urban programs to like the domestic small scale individual house. Um, so we'll move on. So one of the I mean, in trying to curate these events, we face a bunch of challenges. One of them is just actually like people being willing to open up these projects to us. So fortunately for us, like there are sufficient number of really interesting examples that are that architects have done for themselves. So if you look at these projects on this kind of slide, these are in different kind of parts of the country. So like the first project's in Pune, the second is in Bangalore, and the third project is in Calicut. And the interesting and the common thing between these is these are really small scale, very tiny, very tight sites, and each project has kind of generated in just sort of the constraint of the site has helped the architect develop a sort of a very unique language and a very unique way of dealing with the constraint of the site. And I mean, there are things that are common between these, and we're just kind of trying to we're kind of just in the process of trying to like understand what are these and whether there is sort of a common kind of diagram that runs through these projects. So now what we're starting to do is we're starting to kind of group these projects with the kind of, I mean, and look at kind of the similar concerns or similar strategies that might be running through these. we're kind of looking at them through the lens of scale. So while before what we were looking at were like extra small projects, then there are these houses which are again across different cities. So there's Bangalore, Delhi, and again Bangalore. These are small projects. Um, and then like if we look at institutional projects, these are again small scale institutional projects, but of course given the fact that they're institutions, they're much larger institutional projects. Again, I mean, looking at the examples are Bangalore, Mumbai, and Pune here. um, and all of these are kind of all of these projects have very sort of um, um, individual concerns, but also again sort of some concerns run commonly through these projects. Multi-family housing projects. So here we look at, I mean, this is something we would classify as a medium scale project. Um, and again, like here, if you look at it, this is generally Delhi, again Delhi and Calicut. So I mean, it's also interesting because it kind of tends to give you a clue about the what's happening at the urban level also. So cities like Bangalore and Delhi tend to throw up these. I mean, you're able to easily find examples of these standalone projects where architects can actually, experiment and develop different ideas. And like I mean, you can kind of like change your concern from one plot to the other. um, However, other cities like Mumbai, for example, specifically does kind of like tends to trap the architect within the within the other sort of concerns, such as like the concerns of FAR, or like dealing with sort of municipal regulations. So interestingly, if you look at this kind of these three projects, which are institutional projects of a large scale, here what we've got is if the one on the left is Green Acres Academy by Tushar Desai and Associates, and the one in the center is a primary school project in Bangalore by 100 Hands. Interestingly, what we were able to kind of discern between these two projects is that the 100 Hands project is a math diagram, which kind of doesn't have the overarching concern of density imposed on top of it, and therefore it is a ground hugging building that kind of tends to disengage with and disappear into the landscape. Whereas the Green Acres Academy project, if you look at it, is a project that is really having to deal with high density construction. And in this case, what they've managed to do is they've taken the horizontal mat diagram and flipped it vertically. And I mean, they also managed to kind of achieve this sort of flowing institutional spatial condition, but they're doing it vertically. So I mean, it's really interesting for us to now kind of look at these projects and find these kind of linkages between them. Yeah, Brick School is again a mat, but it's a mat that's kind of dealing with the density in between of the other two projects. So going forward, we look at we've kind of seen other institutional projects where we've now, I mean, these are again largish institutional projects in, there's Delhi. I think we've gone back to the previous slide. Yeah, so this is Delhi and Bangalore International Center, which is in Bangalore, and then the Children's Museum at in Mumbai. Again, like if we then we kind of started looking at these other projects, which were extremely large projects. These were kind of more clusters of programs organized on a site. So it's I mean, when you're dealing with, I mean, we're really looking at contemporary architecture and I mean, the kind of programmatic concerns that contemporary architecture is dealing with in India across these kind of super massive scales to like really tiny scales, and we're kind of trying to figure out patterns in between them. This slide, if you look at it, is some very interesting projects, because these are kind of self-generated and projects where the architect was involved not only as a designer but also as an activist. So these projects are kind of looking at reclaiming the public space again, and what you can do using design. So the first project is Church Street in Bangalore by Venkatramanan and Associates, where the architects were involved in actually taking this street back, um, redesigning the entire services of the street, and kind of converting it into a more pedestrian friendly street. The project on the right is where Studio Pomegranate kind of imagined a public space in sort of to kind of um, augment the, I mean, to kind of ameliorate the scarcity of public spaces within Mumbai, and use the underutilized underside of these flyovers in Mumbai, where earlier they were just being used as dumping ground for like confiscated vehicles and haphazard parking. And so what they did was kind of like, with the neighborhood, take up these projects and like create public space and give it back. Again, sort of these three projects, if you look at them, they are again interesting. Architects are now also looking at, concerned with kind of reusing buildings, that instead of demolishing them. And these look at sort of different concerns of preserving heritage, um, conserving resources of the planet, and sort of uh, um, adapting kind of old buildings to newer uses. Um, then I mean, if so jumping I mean moving on from scale, we are also looking at sort of ideas of materiality, and what kind of expression is I mean, architects are engaging with, as far as like the materiality of a project. So from like exposed concrete to kind of interesting facades. Um, Again, and these three projects, if you look at them, are restoration projects of within the kind of old fabric of the city. And largely these three are largely in Mumbai, because generally sort of the dearth of space allows people, and like the historic part of the city is also the premium part of the city. um, and yeah, these are again sort of institutional projects that now we're looking at through the lens of circulation. So we're trying to see if there is a diagram, that a circulation diagram that emerges out of that. These three projects, if you look at them, are interesting because I mean, and interestingly, like the architect is also the client in some way in all these three projects, and they're mostly interesting because the constraints of the site force the architects and the structural engineer to kind of come up with a solution that allowed construction to happen not only fast but also in a, I mean, kind of, they developed a kind of new system or a new module of being able to construct these projects. So the first two projects are largely sort of steel construction within our cities, where generally steel construction is issued because of regulations. However, like these projects show that there is a possibility of expediting projects, saving resources, pre-engineering buildings. The last project is a very different scale of project from the first two, but it looks at sort of structural innovation in kind of engaging with this terrain where like larger spans have to what allows the sort of public space to happen at the lowest level of the project. So like we kind of, so if by going by these, like we are just starting to kind of identify these patterns that emerge across these projects and trying to kind of understand um, what really what are the sort of larger concerns, and what is the what kind of patterns kind of run across the country, and they may not be kind of patterns that emerge pan India, but they may be kind of concerns that small towns are looking at differently, whereas larger cities are looking at them differently. Also, these could be sort of similar. I mean, the diagrammatic patterns across projects could be similar across the geographies, but the material concerns of these projects could be completely different. So, I mean, this is something that we would really like to keep going as a long-term kind of idea. However, and we are really hoping that we can kind of re-engage this and restart this project post the entire COVID-19 crisis is over, and we can kind of go back to collecting in groups and meeting and having these discussions. Because I mean, there's been an explosion of webinars, but it's kind of really, it's nothing beats kind of uh, actually visiting and experiencing these projects on site. So so now this is the first vertical that we programmed, and I'll let Sahil Latheef take you through the other two verticals that we engage.
Okay, thank you, Ekta, for covering the first portion. As Ekta had mentioned in the start, we will cover two more verticals that we concentrate our efforts on. The second being our travel component. This is something that we call the travel with ThreeFlaneurs. Basically, it's an extension of the idea of the India Architecture Open, but to an international scale. Of course, this is much more focused, and it is more based on a study trip format. The idea is to visit different destinations, mostly in Asia, but also a few outside Asia. For example, we have also covered trips to Morocco and Turkey. But within Asia is where we concentrate more on, just for the ease of travel, and also for the familiarity and the fact that we feel that there are a lot of similarities in density and cultural context that can address what is primarily an Indian audience that we have. These are some of the trips that we have already done or we've planned. A few of them are yet to happen, especially the last few of them had to get pushed further because of the current crisis. But these are all planned at us in a quite a detailed way. And what I would like to do is to run you through how we do some of our trips and show you kind of sample itineraries of 3 or 4 of them. So depending on where the destination is, there are multiple ways of curating it and coming up with how do we select what projects to cover or not. For instance, in some places like say in Italy or in Turkey, history takes the driving is the driving force. So be it the Renaissance or the Ottoman Empire, how architecture was perceived in those times and how it evolved from there to today is something that we focus on. Whereas in smaller destinations like in Singapore or in Sri Lanka, it can be much more focused on a certain theme or a certain practice, and that's how the itinerary is put together. So I will, like I said, I will run you through a few examples of these. The first of them being Singapore. Singapore although it's a very compact nation state, it does offer a lot in terms of architecture, especially contemporary architecture, we feel. This is a small kind of booklet, or in some sense, a small piece of documentation that we hand out to the guests who come on our trip. And this not only provides them with kind of drawing material so that they can look at the drawings while we are at the project, but it also gives a kind of overview of the place. And I will run through the Singapore one a little in detail, and then the others we can run through a little quicker. In Singapore, the idea of the whole trip is to uncover the whole city, kind of district by district. So there's two layers to this. One is a kind of historical layering. So we start with the old districts first, and then we move to the outer districts. And coincidentally, what also happens is that the architecture goes from the older style of architecture to the more contemporary, because a lot of the interesting contemporary work is happening on the outer edges of the city. So we start with Chinatown and Little India and looking at the kind of historic center of the city, and then move to the central business district and the kind of the hub of the city, looking at some key projects like the Gardens by the Bay or Marina Bay Sands, trying to not just look at them architecturally, but also in their context, and trying to understand why they have been designed in a particular way, what are they trying to address, what is the city trying to do with these projects. There is an underlying theme to the whole trip, that is to look at the idea of the city in a garden, or to look at the possibilities of what the kind of uniquely Singaporean approach of looking at landscape and built form quite in sync with each other, something that we don't see too much in other Asian cities. And that's why we think it's a interesting paradigm to look at for our highly urbanized metropolises in India to look at. So this is another district of the city. And then as I mentioned, we keep moving further away from the center. So the day 4, we look at the southern ridges and look at very interesting projects like the interlace, which you also see in a photograph on the left here, is a megaform project which looks at a completely different relationship of the tower to the landscape. So it kind of questions that paradigm, which was how Singapore addressed its housing problem for a long time as just standalone towers in a park, whereas this one looks at the question of whether the tower has to be vertical or it can be horizontal slabs that are stacked up on top of each other. So through the entire itinerary, the idea is to get into the kind of the psyche of the city and to understand how the city is developing and what is it that we can learn from, what are the new things that Singapore is throwing into the field of architecture and landscape, and to engage with that. And we end the last day in looking at further outer areas of NUS and the university campuses at the edge of the city, because those again look at the whole relationship of landscape and student life in a very interesting way. And last we end at the airport, which also is in some sense a very interesting phenomenon that a lot of cities in India are embracing, how a transportation hub can become more than just a transportation hub. The next itinerary I will run through, not in much detail. This is Japan. Japan, of course, the scope of a trip to Japan is much more than to a smaller destination like Singapore. So it's obviously also longer. We do anywhere from 10 to 12 days in Japan, and we try to cover more than one city. So of course, we spend a lot of time in Tokyo, but the other big city that we spend a substantial amount of time is in Kyoto, which is the old capital. In Tokyo, our focus is on contemporary architecture to understand a hyper-connected city, a very, very dense urban fabric, but also to look at it from the lens of the metabolism metabolist architectural movement. So the metabolism, as you may be aware, is a movement of architecture that happened post Second World War in the 50s and 60s, and it's probably the not probably, it is the only big contemporary architectural movement that started in Asia and then moved to other parts of the world. So it is very interesting for us to look at this. Also, we see in other places like Singapore and Dubai how these ideas of metabolism have morphed into other things that Asian cities are now dealing with. So in Tokyo, that's what we focus on. Then there's a couple of days we spend in Osaka, and then we go to Kyoto. Kyoto, of course, is the historic capital of Japan. So therefore, there's a lot more emphasis on kind of, you could say, the traditional architecture, but also more importantly on the traditional garden styles. The sorry, the Zen gardens of Kyoto are, in my mind, a highlight of going to Japan. So we do spend quite a lot of time trying to understand what these gardens are, how they are kind of formulated, and what is the experience of actually being there. Mm. The next itinerary I will look at is that that looks at the city of Dubai and its surrounding Emirates of Abu Dhabi and Sharjah. However, for this presentation, I will just concentrate on Dubai, and I will not run through an itinerary, but I will kind of run through the logic of how the itinerary is developed. Um, with a lot of trips that we do both personally and in groups, we've realized that we always have some kind of preconceived idea about a place that we're going to visit, and sometimes those ideas are kind of not based on fact, but just on our kind of impression based on movies or stories that we've heard. And the common perception about the city of Dubai is that, you know, it's kind of like the Disneyland in the desert and anything goes. But what we try to do with our itinerary is to go beyond that narrative and try and understand why the city is what it is right now. So we use kind of a historical um, point of view, or we unravel the city as if it is being kind of developed. And we start with trying to understand the origins of the city as a small trading and fishing center along the creek, and we try to understand what the impact of oil and the development that came because of the oil and the modernization that came because of the oil, how that played out on this kind of quite harsh landscape. And as the trip progresses, we also cover some of the key architectural moments of the city, and those are the images that you see at the bottom of the buildings that we feel are kind of the iconic projects of the city. But they're not iconic purely from the point of view of architecture, but from the point of view of the development of the city, because each one of these buildings also denote a certain point in the city's kind of evolution towards becoming what it is now, kind of like a global hub for business and commerce and tourism. The development of the city in our mind is in three key phases. One is the modernization phase, that is because of the oil and the initial kind of influx of people. Then when the city starts coming into its own and starts building these icons like the Emirates Towers and the Burj Al Arab, kind of putting itself on the map. And then to a more aggressive phase where it's kind of entering this kind of globalization head on and building these mega projects like the Palm Island. And as you can see on the left on the Google map, the development is so fast paced that within a matter of 5 to 10 years, the city is not just doubled or tripled in land area, but also it starts taking these kind of ambitious projects of building islands in the sea and putting these kind of iconic developments like the Burj Khalifa, which is the tallest tower, and now they're planning an even taller tower. Of course, this year would have been an ideal year to visit Dubai because the expo was supposed to happen at the end of the year. However, it's been pushed because of the current crisis to next year. So something that we look forward to kind of visit next year is the expo, because from past experience, we've realized that the World Expo is a great place for architectural experimentation, and that's something that we would like to capitalize on. So that's the whole bit about Dubai. And the last itinerary that I will very briefly again touch upon is that of Sri Lanka. Why Sri Lanka? Because personally, we really it's a place that we've visited more time, and we feel that the architecture, the tropical modernism that happens in Sri Lanka applies very well to a lot of situations that we have in India. And no trip that focuses on tropical modernism and contemporary architecture in Sri Lanka is complete without trying to understand the genius of Jeffrey Bawa. So a lot of the trip is planned around understanding how Jeffrey Bawa's kind of architecture evolved from the start of his simple housing projects to the more complex and bigger projects like the Parliament and the Kandalama. At the same time, we also try to visit some contemporary offices in Sri Lanka. For instance, on the last couple of trips, we've made it a point to visit the studio of Palinda Architects and see some of their projects. And that also kind of gives us a good view of what has happened to Bawa's legacy and how contemporary architects are able to take that idea forward and address it in quite interesting ways. So that's the bit about the travel. And the last component, again, a very short component, I will talk about what we do on social media. Because social media is something that, again, interests us from two perspectives. One, it helps us kind of reach out to people, to connect to people, to not just our audience, but also to architects and to find new projects. But it is also, in some way, a form of education, we feel. As Ekta has mentioned, we're both very much interested in academics, and we try to use the social media platform also in that perspective, to not just put out there about a certain event that we're doing, but to share the knowledge that we are learning from those events and those site visits and trips that we conduct. So a lot of our effort goes into maintaining our Instagram page and to putting out stories, both as live stories and also as kind of revisits, where we cover the events that we do as we do it, kind of live as we do it. Because that gives us the opportunity to share this knowledge with a lot of people. Like, for instance, this first set of images on the top right is images that we were running while we were in Calicut, in Kozhikode, during the Architecture Open. So these events are mostly focused for people who are already in the city. We don't have too many people who travel to other cities. So by putting it out there online on our stories, it becomes a way for people from Bangalore or Bombay or any other part of the world to see what is happening in Calicut and to get an understanding and to get kind of ideas of whenever they visit, what projects they can visit. Same thing with our trips. So while our trip is happening in Istanbul, we are following them live almost, using our stories, so giving the experience to people who are sitting back at home as if they are also part of the trip in Istanbul. Also, something that we have tried recently during the lockdown is to engage with our audience online in different ways. So one thing that everyone's been doing is these kind of webinars, but we also started doing quizzes and polls and trying to kind of share knowledge about architecture, mostly based on projects that we visited and projects that we've been teaching about. So there is some background that we have about these projects. The last thing that we've been trying again during the lockdown is to use our social media as a platform for others. So these are three examples of story takeovers that we've got our friends and colleagues to share of different travel experiences that we have not covered on our social media before. So a trip to Israel or to Mexico, or even to Bundelkhand in central India were covered by others using our platform. Yeah, and with that, I kind of come to the end of our presentation. We of course we are very active on Instagram, but we also have a few websites, including the indiaarchopen.com, where you can see drawings of all the projects that we visited in India. And yeah, with that, I come to an end to our formal presentation. Thank you.
Sahil and Ekta, thank you so much for taking us along on your journey. And I think it's so inspiring and so incredible to see how you weave architecture and your travels in such a beautiful manner. So I would like to start off by, asking you a very, very common and a very simple question that has come to my mind while, listening to you. Whenever you travel to any place, you gather experiences and you gather memories, and they leave behind something in your mind. So, how have your experiences and your travels changed your outlook on your personal, professional, as well as academic life?
Okay. I think, like, for instance, I will talk a little bit from the academic point of view.
Sure.
What has happened is that as you all know, that architects study trips and actually visiting projects is kind of the best. So what has happened over the years is, because we've been able to kind of put together a lot of different types of projects in different kind of cultural and kind of physical landscapes, it becomes very easy for us to kind of give references to students and to explain different possibilities, you know. And I think that's where both looking at history and contemporary, I think, is important, because everything has a certain history, even contemporary architecture, be it a kind of a Zaha Hadid building or a Frank Gehry building, they come from somewhere. I mean, historically, they come from somewhere. They're learning from something. And that is something, as students, sometimes we don't really realize the history, the importance of history, and the importance of kind of thinking beyond just the kind of the idea of the architect as an artist, you know. So that is something I felt personally very important for me, and something that has helped me with the students much better. Talking about actual projects, of course, I've been fortunate to work on a lot of projects that have allowed me to travel for that as well. So they give you a different perspective on how to deal with materiality or deal with a certain kind of building code and things like that. So that's my kind of answer. Yeah.
Ekta, would you like to add something to that?
I think what it does is that it kind of continues to develop this database for yourself, and that helps kind of you can kind of cross reference across cultures, and you can kind of I mean, it's not as if. So one of the most important lessons for me was like not to judge a project in terms of good or bad, or I like it or I don't like it, but to kind of try and understand what is it that the architect has done in that project, and if that project is something that, and when I'm saying project, I mean kind of like, the concern that the architect has, or the kind of parameters with which the architect continues to kind of address these concerns through his life. So if that kind of project interests me, then how is it that I can take the learnings of what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing and bring it back into my work, whether that is my work as a student or whether that is my work as an architect. Yeah, so just kind of traveling and experiencing projects helps open I mean kind of allows you to kind of do that, and it's less sort of judging how good a project is or how bad it is. Yeah.
I agree. And like looking at a project objectively is something that even I as a student sometimes struggle with, because it's really easy to form an opinion
Yeah.
like immediately.
Yeah, and many
That being
projects
said,
have surprised me. Like many projects, just looking at them on paper are very different from like
yeah,
experiencing.
Experiencing them, yeah.
true.
Hi,
Uh,
hi, Ekta and Sahil. This is Vikram.
Hi,
Uh,
Vikram.
yeah, I will like to just add one thing. I went to Istanbul with ThreeFlaneurs, and my experience was really amazing. What I can add to her Simran's question is, when I was doing architecture, I went to Italy with some other group, and it was an architectural trip only. But when I came back, what I had experienced was not just architecture, it was culture, it was the aura of the place, so many things that you learn. It, in itself, just traveling is not just about architecture, you learn so many things about how the culture impacted the architecture as well. So, in case of Istanbul, Istanbul is a place where culture impacted the architecture to a very great extent. So, yeah, so it's just not about one particular building, it's even at urban scale there is a huge impact. So yeah, it's a very good experience, and I was looking forward to go to Singapore with them this year, but unfortunately corona came in and I couldn't go. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Vikram. We'll announce our trip soon enough.
Thank you for sharing, Vikram. Priyanka, would you like to continue?
yeah. So when we compare the way your architecture open and the travels that you organize to how architecture exhibitions are curated, almost like curating a city. And what would be your take on this? Like, what is the process of curating a narrative in the sense of a city?
I think it's really important because I mean cities develop over a really long period of time. Now, of course, it's happening a lot faster, but understanding sort of why a city develops the way it does, and I've lived in Bombay almost all my life, and I feel like you can't understand the city until you understand how it historically it developed the way it developed, and that can kind of help you develop a polemical position and to kind of insert yourself as an architect within that position. um, and going, also looking for legacy of the architects that have kind of contributed to that. I think those are very, very important things because you can't really operate in a vacuum, and you can kind of take examples from other cities. You can kind of look at how other cities have dealt with a certain problem and apply those. So one of the kind of very, very sort of interesting sort of examples or learnings we could take in Mumbai is from a city like Singapore. I mean, we kind of have very similar conditions climatically, and what Singapore is doing is phenomenal in terms of greening that city and making that entire city into an urban kind of forest. And is that a model we can look at instead of like what other vested interests want to kind of just keep looking at I don't know, Shanghai or like Dubai as urban models. We could kind of look at
Sahil, would you want to add?
So you were how is it different from curating an exhibition?
Yeah, like there is, it's almost as if cities have stories,
Yes.
and then when you organize these architecture
Yes.
opens, you kind of explore one strand of that
Yes.
narrative that a city.
Yes.
So how do you choose, like how do you
Oh,
decide on
that
what
how do you
narrative?
choose? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. And that is something that is not fixed actually. It depends, one, on what is kind of happening in the city, what is the strand of thought, or this, like I explained in the city of Tokyo, we looked at the idea of metabolism and how the kind of rebirth of the city after the Second World War was the driving force for how our itinerary was planned. But in Singapore, the approach of landscape and architecture becomes very important. And this is also something that keeps evolving. So every time we are able to revisit a city, I think we are able to fine tune our narrative or add or drop things from that narrative. And narrative is, I think, the right word to use, because it's not about icons, or it's not about particular buildings. Sometimes we may not visit the most iconic building because it doesn't really add too much in terms of the overall understanding of the city, yeah. uh, I hope that
Yeah.
answers the question. But I think also the point that Vikram made is quite important, that to understand the cultural kind of underpinning of the city is as important as understanding the architecture, So to be able to go somewhere and to eat the food and to use the public transport and to kind of really live, even though for a very brief time, to actually live in the city rather than to be like a tourist and just, from your hotel only in these kind of coaches you just drive everywhere. That's something that we are not really interested in. So as much as possible, we try to like walk through the city or use the public transport, really use the city as if we belong to the city, so that kind of breaks also barriers of it. Also, one of the other things that we've realized is that a lot of people who've traveled with us are not as frequent travelers as we've been fortunate to be. So it's also a matter of learning how to travel, or learning how to experience a new city. So all these things kind of become important. So sometimes we want to cover a certain thing, but it's not practical. So, so the itinerary is constantly being tweaked. And that's why we like to revisit cities, because just going to a city for the first time, I think, doesn't do justice to what we want to do. So we ideally always only do cities that we are familiar with.
And
so
we like to change up the narrative also, because like we're constantly discovering new things. I
yes.
mean, we're constantly adding to our itineraries, or like dropping things, adding new stuff, because that's just the thrill of it for us as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And this whole thing about the India Architecture Open has been for me an eye opener, because we started this as a challenge, because we always heard that, in India, architecture kind of stopped after the masters, so after Raj Reval and Korea and Doshi, there's no good architecture. That's the constant argument that we would hear, and that we would almost feel when we planned study trips for students, because you only go to Ahmedabad or you only go to Delhi and Agra, and there's nothing else to teach, or at least that was the argument being made. So this was our challenge, to see projects only built in the last 5 to 10 years and look at interesting projects, and we've seen that there's more than interesting, there's a lot of interesting work. So yeah, that's another
Fair.
thing.
And going off of the whole iconism aspect that you mentioned, that sometimes there is an iconic building, but it doesn't really tie in within the city's narrative.
Yeah.
Since you have a base in identifying these emerging patterns within cities, what would your take on iconism within contemporary architecture be, and like it's how it affects the urban heritage that we are building currently?
Shall I go, Ekta?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I think there is a place for iconic architecture for sure. Like if you see, even historically, there's always been a place for landmarks, a place
Right.
for things that give certain identity to the city. It would be naive to say that all iconic architecture is bad, uh, so they are kind of a celebration of a certain moment in a city's kind of achievement and in its history. So be it the Gateway of India or the Burj Khalifa, they have their place, and what is important to understand is why they have their place, not just merely because it's the tallest building, but because it certain, it announces a certain ambition of the city, a certain progress in kind of aesthetic and structural kind of systems. So to understand why they are iconic and to give it context, I think is important. That being said, not every building needs to be an icon, you know. So this other obsession that we have, like in places like Mumbai, where we need the Dubai skyline. What for? Like, you know, that is not, for me, that is not what is important to learn from Dubai. You know? Maybe it is important to learn how to get business, how to make kind of in a very small amount of time, a different kind of set up different industries and, you know, different model of progress, you know. So that is yeah, that's my point of view. Ekta, you want to?
I agree. I mean, with all those points. I mean, if you look at where the argument kind of formalized itself, it was with the sort of Guggenheim museum that was built in Bilbao, and it's known as the Bilbao effect. But I mean, what's important about the Bilbao effect is what that building did for the city and the economy of a city, which was kind of at the end of its, at the end of its kind of industrial economy. I think that is, I mean, it's important to understand what the ambition of these iconic projects is, and frankly, the success or failure is if they manage to achieve that ambition, and not kind of like, you know, the is my tower taller than your tower kind of example.
True.
So, taking off from something that you mentioned earlier, Sahil, that, you know, as a group, you like to travel to the same city a number of times to understand the various lenses or the various aspects
Yes.
that you can see of a city. So, to that, my question would be, how does your perception change? How does your perception of the architecture and the city as a whole change when you visit one place multiple times?
Oh, I think that's yeah, it does change quite a lot,
Yeah.
and it does constantly change, and sometimes those changes come not from that city but from somewhere else, you know.
Right.
For instance, uh, like I've been visiting Singapore on and off for more than a decade.
Okay.
So I was fortunate to work there for some time as well. So I've seen the city kind of change, and how the architecture is kind of evolved. But also what has happened is within this decade, I was also able to visit Japan and other places which informed what happened in Singapore.
Right.
So so sometimes it's not just seeing the same place again, but because you've seen something else or you've seen it from a different perspective, you have a different kind of appreciation for it, you know.
Right.
So a place as small as, say, even Sri Lanka, we've done trips, like I've done like 5 or 6 trips that look only at the architecture of Jeffrey Bauer, and I think every time I visit, there's a new layer that you kind of understand, or it kind of reveals to you, you know. So earlier, I was really fascinated with this courtyards and with this kind of aesthetic, but I had no understanding of where the aesthetic comes from and what he was really trying to do. But now that I've seen more of the historic side of Sri Lanka and seen like the old cities of Anuradhapura and Sigiriya, I kind of understand where Jeffrey Bauer is coming from, you know.
Right.
So that adds a different kind of appreciation for what he achieved.
Yeah.
And I guess that goes for every city, you know. So
I mean,
you know,
conversely, even like if you look at Lunu Ganga, Jeffrey Baba is taking. I mean, he's drawing inspirations in Lunu Ganga from like Italian villas and Italian sort of landscape. It's so the cross referencing, like once you've seen something, you come back to it, you know, with the kind of like you've added on an experience through what you've seen, and you come back to it with that added on experience, it kind of changes your perspective completely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Fair. Also, so as a student myself, what advice would you have to give to like fresh graduates and students about finding their niche in the industry? Because what I think like what you do is so different and so fresh and creative, and for someone to come up with something like that is amazing. Like
uh, how do you find your niche? I think that is something like I'm quite reluctant to suggest to like students or to young graduates what they should do. I think it's something that you have to discover for yourself, and you have to we see the opportunity to travel and to visit projects as a way, as a catalyst to help you formulate your idea better, or to understand what you want to do. Like when I had finished studying architecture, I had no idea on I had no idea that I would do whatever I did, So it's something that, and this is something that I see a lot with students nowadays, this, the TikTok generation, everything has to be very quick. And I think that's in some sense, like a danger, that we have to be able to kind of step back and appreciate. And in some sense, the lockdown has forced us to do that, to kind of sit back and to judge, to see what is happening and to try and understand, make sense of it, to now question and say, okay, what is it that I want to do, and the other thing is that there is a lot of different things happening now, a lot more variety of things, a lot more variety of scopes of what you can do as an architect. And like some of the examples that Ekta showed in the India Arch Open has shown that there are projects that are completely driven by an architect's kind of cry for open space, or even on your design conversations, we've seen a lot of variety of very small offices doing projects that are the size of a room but are quite meaningful, so it's something that I'm always reluctant to kind of suggest, okay, do this, it's something you have to discover.
I think there's two ways. One is kind of really dedicate yourself to learning the craft. So for like fresh graduates, like devote yourself to an office where you kind of like the office, the work, the office culture, and really kind of get into that, and then take time off and go explore and see what else is happening. So I think those are essentially two processes in which you can kind of continue to learn and eventually discover your niche, or don't discover it. I mean, just continue kind of reinventing yourself.
Yeah, definitely. So, to wrap up, I would like to ask you the last question about the nostalgia, the memories, and the experiences that go hand in hand with traveling. So, I know this is going to be a tricky and a tough question, having said that you've traveled for over decades now. But what has there been a particular experience or a particular building or a particular place that you have visited that has found like a special place in your heart over all these years?
That is a very difficult question to answer. Uh, well, I would say the first time I kind of so two buildings really stand out for me. One would be sort of Jeffrey Bawa's Kandalama. I mean, because that is a project that is just simply unparalleled in my experience. And the second one would be kind of looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York. Those are two that really, really stand out for me.
Yeah, I would. I think more than particular buildings. Of course, these buildings are brilliant. Like Kandalama is amazing, but rather than buildings, I think what really fascinates me more is the place. So, for instance, like even though it's like kind of a cliche, like I really like New York. And the experience of the city, and trying when you're there, and the energy, and you're trying to really understand why the city is taken that particular form and really kind of trying to understand the culture of the city. So the cities that have grown over some time, like even like Istanbul and all, these kind of cities that have these layers really interest me. So that is something that, you know, over the years, something that I've kind of have a much more appreciation for how how layers of history kind of make a difference, how the culture of the city kind of creeps into everything. So over the last few years, there have been a lot of trips that I've done in, especially in the Middle East area, in Morocco, in Jordan. All these are really things that I have now a lot more appreciation for than when I started travel, because initially when we were traveling, it was about like kind of like a checklist, you know, you go and like tick everything off. Now I like to kind of understand more of why there still is a checklist, but you know, there's more than a checklist now. You know, there's also an understanding of trying to understand why the city developed like that. Yeah, but it's a impossible question, you know, how do you pick a building?
Yeah.
I know. All right. So thank you so much for sharing your wonderful experiences with us. And I think everyone who participates and watches, you know, your travel through stories definitely has the aspiration to probably join you on your next travel, I'm pretty sure. So thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing, and thank you for being a part of Design United, Sahil. That was lovely having you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, guys.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Simran. Thanks,
And
Priyanka.
hopefully when the lockdown is over, we can meet in person.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
Sahil, I have one thing to ask you.
Yes.
So when are we planning for New York now?
Yeah, I think like this lockdown has changed everyone's plans.
Now knowing that it's your like one of your place that you're really fond of.
I mean, I just picked one, but yeah, I can name 10. Yeah, soon.
Okay.
Hopefully soon. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye. Stay
Thanks.
safe.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.